I'd just like to thank everyone for attending today and being part of this conversation. And I know that Ita didn't have a lot of time to put it together and promote it. So I'm grateful for those who could come, and I understand it's being recorded. So it'd be wonderful if other people get the chance to listen to it in due course and watch it. My book, as Ita said, is called Beyond Alice, and I'll just hold it up there for a moment, and it'd be interesting to know whether anyone's actually read it. So if you have, you could maybe say yes. Well, Ita definitely has.
Yes.
Thank you, Ita. It'd be interesting to know if anyone else has. But Kimberly, not yet. Well done, Kimberly. That's on your list. This is my third memoir, and can I just give a little talk about this very briefly?
Sure.
I read, Ita.
Yeah, go for it.
Thank you. Great, Chris. So I started out with Alice to Prague. In fact, I should have had all three books here with me to hold up, but hopefully you'll get to see them at the library. But I didn't set out to write memoirs, and here I am having written my third. It was just that I really wanted to write the stories about the people I met in the Czech Republic after I turned from being there in the mid-90s. And so that led to Alice to Prague, and in the end, the publisher wanted me to weave in some of my own story because it made for a real contrast, Central Australia to Central Europe. And then my second memoir evolved because my publisher said, and sorry, I think I might have already mentioned this, Ita, but for those who might not have heard it, my publisher said, look, you think that Central Europe is interesting, but for most people on the East Coast, Central Australia is just as interesting and as exotic. So that led to my second memoir, An Alice Girl, which is all about growing up here on a cattle station in the 60s and 70s, doing School of the Air, living in the stock camp, mustering cattle, and just having this life of complete freedom. We were little men doing big men's work, my sister and my two brothers and I, and we loved it. So that finishes at age 12, when my idyllic life is about to be ruptured forever, really, for all time. And it was because, like all bush kids, I had to be sent away to boarding school for secondary education, because in the bush, we had no secondary education options, and the Northern Territory government paid parents a subsidy to send their children away. So it was a given, it was inevitable, we had no choice. So it was something I knew that was going to happen. And if you've read An Alice Girl, you'll see at the start I foreshadow this, and at the end I'm dreading it, because I know it's going to, irrevocably change my life, which it does. So that led to the third memoir, because the second one finished at age 12, and a lot of people wrote to me and said, well, we want to know about boarding school, we want to know about what happened. And so, in fact, this became really the coming of age story that interweaves boarding school and outback holiday adventures, set from 1975 to 1979. And interestingly, I've had a lot of people write to me since and tell me that their boarding school stories from the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s are remarkably like mine, Australia-wide. So I'm going to start with reading from, is it all right if I read 2 and a bit pages, Ita?
Yeah, of course. It's your show.
Thank you. I don't want to bore people, but this is pretty much my first night at boarding school, and you'll get a sense of what it was like for this wild, free-spirited bush kid who'd only lived in jeans and boots and done School of the Air and correspondence school to suddenly be in a uniform with a tie and a tunic and stockings and shoes and rules. I walked past the telephone. It was outside the boarding house mistress's office. Just looking at it made my stomach tighten. We'd been told first years were allowed to make 1 phone call home per week by reversing the charges and speaking for a limited time to their families. The older girls had told us that the boarding house mistresses listened in. It was difficult to have private conversations. At that moment, I longed even for a public conversation with my family just to hear their voices. But we had no telephone in the bush, and the one on the table felt like a cruel reminder of how far away I was. It was almost more than I could bear, not knowing when I would talk to my family again and hear their voices. After dinner, the head boarding house mistress, Miss Wadley, summoned all the first years to the common room. The other mistress, Miss Slater, stood by her side, blinking through owl-type glasses. Now, girls, rules to remember, began Miss Wadley. Our main corridor here, and indeed all the corridors, are not for running. We walk everywhere in a ladylike manner. Do you understand? We do not shout, we do not yell, we do not laugh loudly, we do not walk up the main stairs ever. I stared in disbelief. How could I not run or shout or yell or laugh loudly? I'd been free in the bush all my life. We ran everywhere, shouting and yakking. But the mistress tapped her pen on the table. Consequences for disobedience include cleaning work, no telephone, no television, no activities, and most importantly, she paused, gating. Silence hung in the air. I felt sick. What was gating? Was it like the bush gate? That was the gate through which Dad sent the old cows who were no good for market, the young calves and the heifers and steers that still needed to be fattened up, or any other cattle he didn't have a use for at that time. Whatever it was, gating did not sound good. One final thing, said the mistress, ushering Miss Slater towards the door, who was still blinking through her owl-type glasses. You do not go out near the fence or the front gate or any of the side gates or anywhere that people on the main road may see you. The gates are locked, but even if they aren't, under no circumstances do you ever leave them, open them or leave the school grounds without permission. The punishment for that is expulsion. I felt my legs giving way. This was prison. How would I ever survive? When we were finally allowed upstairs to our dormitory, I hurried to the long, narrow window above my bed and gazed out of it, searching desperately for something I recognised. I looked for stars that I knew, for a way to connect to home. I thought if I could just find the Southern Cross or the Milky Way or the saucepan, I could orientate myself and imagine a link back to the outback skies. But as I squinted into the glass, all I saw was blackness between me and the silhouette of dark trees, and beyond that, the glare of city lights. Below us rumbled the relentless sound of rushing traffic. This was a city, a different world. Perhaps there were no stars in a city. Perhaps they couldn't get in. I sat back and a nasty, shadowy feeling rushed over me. Then I ran my fingers along the glass and shoved my fist into my mouth to stop the sound of sobs. For the first time in my life, I was really on my own. And how was I going to survive it? I'd never been without my family or without friends very close to my family. I was 12 and I'd never really lived anywhere but Outback Australia. There I knew every dip of the ranges, the direction of the creek bed's curves, the hidden waterfalls and faraway gullies, the soft palette of colours at sunrise and sunset. There I could walk and ride and muster cattle and camp under the stars and never get lost. The land was imprinted on my being. What was this place with no stars? Miss Slater was at the door. Lights out now, girls. The room was plunged into darkness. And then I remembered the sound of animals in pain, a bullock with a broken leg, a cow who'd lost a calf to a dingo, a scrubber bull dying as predators attacked him. They all gave out great moans of deep agony, of loss, of inconsolable rage and despair, of the fear of death. Their pain always seemed worse at night. I pulled my pillow over my head so no one could see my body heaving and shaking, and no one could see or hear those sounds coming from me. I didn't fit in. I didn't belong here. This was not my home. I wanted to die, to escape it all. How was I ever going to survive?
Oh, yay. So sad. I feel so sad for little Tanya. Thank you so much. I just love hearing the stories in your voice. Oh, look, and I actually said here, I felt so sorry for young and tiny Tanya when you first went to Adelaide boarding school. Can you please explain to us why children from the Outback had to go to boarding school for the high school years, and what has changed for bush kids over the years? I know your mum was very involved in trying to get, more empathy for the bush kids and get schools in the LS. So maybe you can talk a little bit about that.
So the Northern Territory Outback is very similar to Outback West Australia, Outback Queensland, New South Wales, South Australia, even those northern parts of Victoria. When you're isolated and in remote and rural areas, and it's the 60s and 70s, there are no secondary schools that you can access. And so for us, living on a cattle station, there wasn't a chance that we could go to a secondary school. So as I mentioned earlier, the Northern Territory government paid bush parents a subsidy to send their children away, and they either went as a rule to Queensland or down to Longreach in Queensland and Charters Towers, or Adelaide in South Australia. And my family had originally come from South Australia, and so that's where I was to go. And it was a foregone conclusion, and we were booked in about 3 months after we were born, because there was a very big waiting list, because back then there were a lot of children living in remote and regional areas who didn't have access to secondary education. So when I was 3 months, I was booked into this school. Now, this school was known at the time as MLC, Methodist Ladies College. The boys called it Men's Last Chance.
Nice.
Which was probably right. Anyhow, it was a school that entirely lived up to its name, and that was replicated across Australia, this Victorian era style of boarding school taken straight from Britain and plonked all around Australia. This Victorian era style where you were locked in behind stone walls and you wore these uniforms and you were taught to be a lady, and in our case, and that you were essentially cut off from your family. So the thinking of boarding schools at the time was that you took the children, you closed the door, and the parents lost any rights. The children barely got to speak to their family. I had letters. We wrote letters. But once you were there, it was also that prison style approach. You break the spirit of the individuals, you form one mass, and then you have one compliant mass of children. And that was the thinking, that was the approach. There were one or two exceptions, but I have had a lot of people write to me since I wrote this book saying it was their story, and these were different parts of Australia, all different parts of Australia. So it was a model. Alice was just one of the many models, and children had to suck it up. There was no chance to escape. Things have improved enormously since those days. One, because of an organisation called the Isolated Children's and Parents Association, ICPA for short, which began in individual states as a means of parents desperately trying to make sure their children could get access to education and not be penalised by the tyranny of distance. It's now a federal body supported by state groups, and it's a very powerful body Australia-wide now, and it has direct access to Canberra, which is astonishing when I think that my mum was the inaugural Northern Territory president, and they had these little meetings on School of the Air. They all called in over the radio and tried to share the issues they were all struggling with, getting their children either educated through correspondence school or mostly at a distance. Anyhow, that group was enormously powerful as a catalyst for bit by bit changing the approach to boarding schools. And now most boarding schools in Australia, you're talking chalk and cheese. The children suffer homesickness, especially if they come from the bush. There's no way around that. But now you have boarding schools with really good caring mistresses who give pastoral care. Children have a phone. They can FaceTime mum and dad every day if they want to, because they have a phone, and most cattle stations now have satellite phone access. They can Skype. They can see other people. The rules aren't so strict, and a lot of the single schools have become co-ed as well, for economic reasons as much as anything else, which also broadens the opportunity for people not to feel so lonely and isolated. Yeah, and my mum, her experience in sending us away was so traumatic because, you know, she lost us, but also the school shut that door, and she had no rights. The minute we went into the doors of Methodist Ladies College of Adelaide, she lost all rights as a parent. And there's a chapter or two in here about how she tries to contact the headmistress when I'm having a particularly difficult time, and the headmistress won't speak to her. You know, the parents had handed their children over, and that was it. So mum spent much of her life lobbying for and creating this amazing day and boarding school called St Philip's in Alice Springs, which now has 700 students, and it gives bush people the opportunity to give their kids you know, an excellent you know, city class education here if they don't want to send the children away, or the children can start here and then go on to develop, you know, social skills that you can really only get by being in bigger groups and bigger areas. But when they're older and they're more accustomed to being away, so they already have better social skills. So boarding schools today are a very different kind of institution, but the story of, you know, my time in the 70s, I think was not uncommon, but nobody's actually written about it before, to the best of my knowledge. So it was also very cathartic to write and to tell the stories of not just myself, but the other kids who were there.
Yeah, it's an amazing story. And for me, not having grown up here, for me, it sounded so old-fashioned. I thought, surely that wasn't in my lifetime. It sounds like it was in the 50s. Yeah. So I'm glad that has changed now. So my next question, you actually just read that out, because I said at the start of the book you write, I didn't fit in, I didn't belong, and you just actually read that. And that it reminded me of a scene in Alice to Prague when you first arrive in that village where you don't know anybody, you feel like you don't belong, and you're going to teach English there. So did boarding school prepare you for difficult times in your adult life?
Look, I think that it did. It's interesting. I'm cross that I haven't actually got my other two books with me. But,
yeah, same. But, they're in the library.
Yeah. When I arrived in Sedlčany, this village in Alice to Prague, I write about the first night being just like my first night back at boarding school. But I was furious with myself in Alice to Prague because, you know, I said, Tanya, what were you thinking? At least this time you had a choice. Back then you had no choice. What were you thinking coming to a place like this where you would face all the same issues of essentially being on another planet with no language skills, no social skills, no connection? But boarding school did a lot of good things. So boarding school itself teaches you many skills, life skills. You learn to get on with we had 700 children in the school. It was predominantly a day school, but we had 120 boarders. That's a lot of girls to live with when you've only lived with your family in isolation. You have to learn very fast to, you know, sink or swim, literally, to develop those social skills, to learn how to get on with other people. It makes you more broad-minded. It makes you curious then about other people, and you start to understand that there are worlds different to your own, and you learn tolerance because we were all so different and we'd come from different backgrounds. I also learned the glorious beauty of the sisterhood, which I experienced for the first time when, you know, we girls, we had no family, we only had each other, so we became each other's little family, and that sisterhood exists today. It's 46 years on, and almost all of us are still friends, which is quite remarkable. We live all over the country and the world. It teaches you independence. You learn very quickly to stand on your own 2 feet and to do without your family. Now, I think it's incredibly unnatural. You know, we started off by talking about what primal herd animals we all really are. This pandemic has shown how much we need other people, isolated from other people. You know, is very unhealthy for us, particularly mentally and emotionally. So it's not natural to take a 12-year-old child from their family and institutionalize them. There's no doubt about that. But in the circumstance, it was the best thing going. It was for the greater good. And the greater good of that is that you learn very quickly to be independent. So at a very young age, I learned how to survive on my own, for better or worse. And so to this day, I know that those skills have enabled me to travel and live in lots of different places and do difficult things, but possibly none as difficult as going to settle Chani in the Czech Republic 4 years after communism had fallen and the Berlin Wall had fallen, but actually in these little country towns, old habits died hard and the old way of living under communism hadn't really gone at all. And people were enormously suspicious of this outsider, worst of all, this Westerner. And so I faced afresh all those same terrors that and that sense of utter aloneness and abandonment, because you are abandoned. This time it was voluntary, but you know, it's that sense of I could die here and no one will ever know, because there's nothing that connects you back to your tribe. But it was the boarding school skills that led me to be so curious and interested about what was there at that time, that led me there, and then gave me the skills, I think, to work out strategies to survive, and then in the end have the most amazing, wonderful experience.
It's so good. And like you said, with connection, we can now connect through Zoom, so we can still see each other. But back then, and you just mentioned it as well, your mum, she wanted to ring you in the 70s. They had the things she had to go through, because you didn't have a phone in your property, your cattle station. So she had to go to Alice Springs, go to, ask her friend to use her phone, all these sort of things. And then she couldn't even get through to the headmistress. So do you think that's why your mum became such an advocate for children's, connection to their parents while they were in boarding school?
It was definitely the catalyst. It burned this fire in her belly of rage and disbelief and grief and guilt at not being able to protect her child.
Yeah.
And then, my sister went and had the same scenarios, and then my brothers. And so it became cumulative. And she started talking to other parents and discovered their children were exactly the same. And so bit by bit, this fire in her belly became something she decided, I'm going to do something about this. No parent should be denied the right of looking after their child or speaking to their child if need be, or seeking help for their child. And so when she was involved in the building of St. Philip's, this amazing day in boarding school in Alice Springs, she was instrumental in designing the boarding house and in particular the windows, because she knew that, and this is the same particularly for country kids everywhere, when you get sent away at a young age, it's not your family that you miss, it's the land, because the land has shaped you, you've grown up on it. And then you're in a city where nothing makes sense and it's cold and there's no warmth. And so she designed the windows in this boarding house to be large and open so that they could look out onto the red ranges of Alice Springs and the huge blue Centralian sky, so that even if kids had come in from cattle station or a mission or wherever they'd come from and they were missing their family, at least they still had their land, or they could see their land, or connect to it. So yeah, it was very instrumental in her doing so many extraordinary things.
Yeah, that's amazing. I also love in all your books how you write about music. And last time we were talking about the Tamworth Musical Festival, and it was cancelled, but hopefully next time it will be on.
Yes.
But you were all really into country music, and I liked to read how you were playing the guitar and singing all your sad songs. And then one of the girls asked, do you know any pop songs? And you go, no. And she goes, well, there's this new band. It's called ABBA. And you go, oh, I don't know who they are. And then she goes, you'll have to watch Countdown. And then you watch it and you fell in love with ABBA. So I feel this connection to you because it's one of my favorite bands still. So
Yes.
to watch Countdown with the other girls and then finally get to pop music instead of country music, did you feel more connected to the other girls? Did you feel like you had another connection with them then?
Yes. I think there are many ways we connect to people, and the creative arts in whatever form is one of them. And for me, music was definitely one of them. And as I write about in all my books, music played a huge part in our growing up. It's sort of it's that classic romantic image, but it's true. Sitting around the campfire at the end of a long day in the stock camp with the stockmen with their guitars and us with our guitars and singing. And we only knew songs about the land. And so all our songs pretty much were sad because life on the land was pretty tough. But it was that kind of music, and Slim Dusty was our hero, and all we wanted to do was go to the Tamworth music show, as I told you. We just thought that would be the best ever. So when I came down to boarding school, and I don't really write about this, but I was mocked mercilessly for my love of country music and the fact I didn't know anything else. And it was, I think, instinct that led me to think, well, my friend Denise said this group ABBA is fantastic and you should watch them. And so the instinct was, well, I should do something that everyone seems to like, because already then I was learning about peer pressure or the benefits of being part of a group and understanding what that all meant. And of course, because I loved music and everything about ABBA was joyous, but also very structured in its it wasn't country music, but it had the same sort of very strong major chords and great harmonies, because country music had great harmonies. You know, ABBA and country music are chalk and cheese, but there were similarities in the structure that I connected with much more than I did with, say, Skyhooks, which was also the band at the time, and they had this song called Horror Movie, which I just thought was insane, and it sounded like a horror movie, the whole song, even though all my peers, you know, loved it and loved Shirley jumping around on the stage in his tight jeans. So it took me a while to connect to that kind of music, but ABBA, I was there. And funnily enough, and funny that you should mention it, just this morning I heard Waterloo and I started dancing just around the sitting room, because it just has that joyous effect, and It reminds me of connecting with those girls. And it was a real bond for us, because it was one of the few times we're allowed to watch television, and it was a really happy time because Countdown was fabulous.
Yeah, it sounded so happy. And you were such a bush girl, because when you write about your first dance and you have your best jeans ready and your best, you know, top and your boots and you're ready to go, and then all the other girls come, Tanya, you can't wear that. And I just love it where they say you have to wear a dress, okay. And then you say, and I'm quoting you here, why do I have to wear the same outfit as everyone else? And I think, yes, why indeed? Why do we all want to look the same? I'm so glad that's not so much the case anymore, even though, you know, teenage girls probably still do that. But I just thought that was so brave of you to say that. And then the green eyeshadow. Oh, my God, that was so funny. Maybe you can tell the others about it who haven't read the book. Because
yes, well, our first social, so I'd grown up, of course, with bush dances, and, you know, we'd all get together once a year or so for a big camp draft race meeting, literally out in the bush, in the middle of the flat. And somebody would, you know, pour some rough concrete on the red dirt, and we'd all dance in our jeans and boots to a country music band. That's what dancing was to me. And then, you know, we've got this social. So, of course, I'd pull out my best riding trousers and polish up my boots, and it made no sense to me at all that I had to wear a dress. I couldn't, there was no logic in it for me. It flew against everything I understood about dancing. And then this whole concept of why we all had to be the same. And I think in a boarding school, it's probably the same now, as you say, for teenage girls, perhaps even worse because of the pressure of social media. But back then we were all squashed in together and we only had each other. And the other thing I found very quickly was the importance of dressing the same, having the same sort of hairstyle, the same lip gloss, the same style, if possible, so that we didn't stand out. And again, it's that tribal thing that, you know, we are herd animals, that need to all look the same. There must be some comfort in it. So of course I just was flouting the rules at every turn. First of all, my jeans and my boots, and then this lovely girl Lulu said to me, look, I've got some green eyeshadow and that might go well, so just put some on. So I took the eyeshadow, this little palette, up to the washroom with this big mirror, and I sort of put my finger into it really, really hard, and then just smeared it all over and all over and all over. So this was complete top to bottom, completely bright green, a vivid bright green. I looked, I suppose, like a clown. And there's this long, terrible silence, and all the girls just going, oh dear, like there truly is no hope for this girl. Yeah, I was such a hick. I was so different. I didn't fit in at any level. Now the lovely girl Lulu, she got me and she got a tissue and she was rubbed and rubbed till I was still, then instead of being bright green, I was bright red from rubbing. But at least I wasn't a complete humiliation because I don't think they would have let me go to the social. I think they would have found a way to make me stay behind.
Oh, that's just so funny. I could just see you there with your green eyeshadow. You write it really well. I could just see it. And then, you know, you have all these strict rules at boarding school, but then when for the holidays, you would go home. So you have this humongous freedom there, even though you had, you know, lots of work to do. But how did you cope with those really, really strict rules at boarding school? And then when you go home, you have all the freedom of the world. How did you cope? Yeah. Such extremes.
Such extremes. So it was such an extreme to go to boarding school and try to fit in. I had no idea that I'd almost have to go through the same process just in reverse. And that was when I got off the plane and got home to everything I'd been longing to see, dreaming of, wanting to touch, to hug. It was a bit like watching a movie of other people in another place that I'd been dreaming of, but I was the outsider looking in. I was a bit player observing. It was such a surreal feeling that I didn't belong there anymore. And to start with, I'd arrived wearing a dress and my brothers and sister and everyone else were in jeans and boots. So I had to rip the dress off pretty quickly and replace them with my work clothes and my hats, you know, work hat stuffed on my head. But it was actually really challenging because you go away, you put in this supreme effort to survive. Boarding school is about survival. So as much as I was learning, you know, at school, I was learning how to fit in and survive in this whole new dreadful world. And then I came back to the world that I knew, but I was like in between two worlds. And I think that is still a scenario because it was very interesting. I had this lady write to me who lives on a sheep station in North Queensland, and she said, my girls go to boarding school and they have the same challenge every time they come home for holidays, fitting in, going through that process of readjusting to fit in. And this is, you know, 2021. So I think that is one of the very difficult aspects of leaving this freedom to rules and then returning, and then of course having to leave once you just start to fit back in home was even worse than going the first time. And in fact, I think then returning to boarding school, it got progressively worse. It didn't actually get better right up until the end. Every time got worse and worse because you knew what was going to happen. You knew how hard it was going to be to work through the homesickness of those initial few weeks when you return. It was like this ping pong. I do remember a couple of times thinking, is it even worth going home for that joyous week or so, given the pain I'm going to have to endure returning. And I felt that then all my adult life, whenever I'd leave home and go somewhere else, it was still an issue that I'd have to go through that. So it's the only comforting thing is that it's not just me. It's clearly it happens probably to almost all children, unless what they leave and go to are far more similar. I think that is one of the good things about most boarding schools today, though, because children can get on a phone or Skype, they can see their horse, they can see their dog, they can see the cattle, they can see the horse yards, they can see the cattle yards, they can talk to people. The shock of losing that isn't so great, so the shock of returning to it isn't so great either, but it's still just one of those life scenarios that I don't think there's actually any real cure for, and you just got to go through it.
Yeah, there's such extremes, and well, they're certainly grown tough in the country because, or in the bush, and I'm going to quote you here on page 171, you go, everyone always had a mighty fine time at Mount Doreen, especially as they had tantalizingly dangerous things out there like death adders. Are you serious, Tanya? That's what they think is mighty fine in the bush. Please explain.
Well, the bush to us was the safest place of all. So if you went somewhere that had death adders, we didn't have them. So the Mount Doreen, the station on which our friends lived, was about 400 to 500 miles to the west, towards the West Australian border. And once you got there, the topography was really different, the landscape and the animals. We didn't have death adders in Central Australia. They did out there. We had king browns and they didn't. So, yeah, you wouldn't think that 500 miles of sort of nothingness would create such a difference in animals. So for us, this was so exciting. It was a new kind of snake. And death adder sounded just so tantalizingly scary that we kids thought this was marvelous, just absolutely marvelous. Of course, this is all because we live in our imaginations. We hadn't actually stepped on one. It might have been a different thing if we'd done that. But for us, this was just one of the very exciting things about going to Mount Doreen.
It just blew my mind. I was actually telling my husband about it yesterday. He goes, it's not all Australians that think that is exciting. And in your book, you write a lot of stories and tell them to the other girls there. And one of my favorites is The Sting. And at the end, I think it's so clever that you let Jane say, we will never know if it was a true story. So are you going to write fiction in the future, or will you stay with true stories?
I do want to write fiction. I'd always written fiction as a kid.
Yeah.
And then, as I said, I never intended to write memoirs. They just happened because of the kinds of stories that I wanted to tell or people were interested in hearing. I've got one more I really want to write that involves the Czechs. I've even got a title for it, Return to Prague.
Oh.
So I've got Alice to Prague and Alice Girl, Beyond Alice, upside down.
Yeah.
Return to Prague to sort of complete it. There's some more stories there that that are swirling around that I want to write. But then I do want to write about fiction, although now I'm a bit nervous because if I write 3 or 4 memoirs, will I be able to write fiction? Given I used to, I think I've just got to start practicing and then hopefully it will flow out. But I do write my memoirs in as much as I can in sort of chapter book style, so that each chapter is like a scene in a movie or a chapter of something happening rather than just reflections, which a lot of memoirs are. So I try and have sort of time frames around the chapters and so forth. So I'm on my way to braving fiction. So cross fingers for me, Ita.
Oh, you have such an imagination. I'm sure you'll be fine with fiction. And talking about chapters, my favorite chapter is chapter 26, which is called Wiggling Bottom. It's just so joyful and empowering, and it just made me giggle. So, you know how you write chapters and different stories. So in your Beyond Alice book, have you got a favorite chapter or story?
That's a good question. That is a very good question. I definitely think Wriggling Bottoms is right up there because that was perhaps, apart from studying matric year 12, that was perhaps the hardest thing that I'd ever done. Oh, and being a prefect, that was also pretty difficult. But when I think about it now, I was 16 and a half when I started matric. We were all a bit younger then. And all of a sudden, I was in charge of 40, 50 girls in my house, because we had the school was split into 4 houses, and we had to do a choir competition. And because I played music, I was just automatically thrown into the role of choir conductor. And I'd never conducted anything, and most of the school choirs had 4 parts minimum to them. You had first, second, third, fourth, and then sometimes more. And they were really complicated pieces. And for the school choir, you had to have a set piece, which was, of course, complicated. Then you had to have an a cappella piece, and then you had one of your own choice that could be fun. So I remember feeling the responsibility of this enormously. And it's not like the school choir. Kids go into a school choir because they like to sing. They choose to go in there. But for the house choirs, you dragged everyone from your house in and said, you've got to learn to sing and you've got to learn these parts, because we need a big team. And so I think that was the hardest thing that I had to do. And I was so despairing throughout much of it. But on the day, I will remember always going into that altered space of finally standing on the stage, and there's my choir, and they've worked their hearts out for 3 months, and I've learned to use a baton, I've learned to conduct, and I start and we're away, and then we're on fire. And the joy of being part of a group that had come together to create this unbelievably beautiful sound was indescribable. I felt almost incandescent with joy. I just became part of it. I forgot about the audience. I forgot that, we were actually in a competition. And then for the last one, which was Wouldn't It Be Lovely from My Fair Lady, I was having so much fun up there, and I didn't realise it, but my pocket was wiggling 10 to the dozen. And apparently that the Gillingham Hall was packed to the rafters, and apparently my wriggling bottom attracted as much attention as Wouldn't It Be Lovely. But writing about that experience, and then on the day, just the joy of performance with a group. And actually, there's something really lovely from that, because this book, brought up a lot of demons about boarding school, but the school itself, the education part, was wonderful. And that's where I really learned a lot of, that's how I then got to be able to go to university and have a legal career, rather than returning to the cattle station and marrying the boy next door and working all my life in the cattle yard. So the school gave me that amazing education. So we went back to the same hall for the launch of this book. So Fantastic. It was quite a process to go there. But because the boarders had always sung with me, and I had my guitar, and in the boarding house, Country Roads, which was my favourite song, became our anthem, and all the boarders would sing along, because, Country Roads, take me home to the place where I belong, all these homesick boarders. And so I got up on the stage of Gillingham Hall, where I'd once played my guitar. Well, actually, I played my guitar there, my sister and I, quite a lot, but where I'd led the Delphi choir, and I stood in the same spot and looked around. And then I turned to all the girls below, because there were so many boarders who came, and said, come up. And I had my guitar. So I wasn't conducting them, but they rushed onto the stage, and you will not believe it, they just all went into choir formation. First, second, third, fourth. And we all sang Country Roads. I played my guitar, and I felt that same sense of incandescent joy of connecting with other people through music, through these incredible melodies, and the bond of this sisterhood. So those two experiences, I think, will live with me forever.
Oh, great. It's funny that you mentioned that song, because as I was reading your book, that was the song that I kept singing. My husband goes, why are you singing that song? So, well, Tanya's playing it again.
Yeah, she's playing it, all the girls are singing along.
Too funny. We only have 10 minutes left, and I have so many more questions, but I thought I'll open it up to the audience. If you have any questions, just type them in the chat box, and I will ask them of Tanya. And while they're typing, we might do one more question of me. So at the end of the book, you say you collaborated with a few of your fellow boarders to get all the stories and the timeline straight. And in the beginning of our talk, you already said something about a lot of you stayed friends, but did you reconnect with others for this book, or were they all people you stayed in contact with?
Pretty much we'd all stayed in contact in to one degree or another. Some we saw more often than others. But what was incredibly lucky and fortuitous, I think, that made this book really possible, is that 2019, when I launched Alice to Prague, at the end of that year, I went to Adelaide. So this is just before, COVID, March the following year. And we had an anniversary, a school anniversary. And I hadn't gone to a lot of the anniversaries because the ending of school for me was really difficult, and I struggled to go back for lots of reasons, really. And I'd see those we'd stayed in contact with. Some of us shared houses through uni, and so I'd had those contacts. I didn't really feel the need, but I went to this one. I said, come on, Tanya, you got to be brave. You've got to do this. So back I went, and it was incredibly joyous, and we sang Country Roads and the school song and lots of others, and we started sharing stories, and people just came out of the woodwork said, we should write this down. Tanya, you should write this down. You should start writing this like, days of old. So when I came to write this, we had this group. This clever girl had connected us all on social media. We had our own little Facebook group. So I said to her, this was Trina, my great friend from first year, I said, Trina, can you contact everyone and ask, if we've got stories, would they be open to sharing them and talk about them? So she was fantastic, and she did that. But there were three of us, one in Switzerland, one in the mid-north of South Australia on a farm, and Trina in Adelaide. And so I wrote all the chapters. I'd send to them by email. They'd return. They'd say, no, that date's wrong. And they had brilliant memories, and one of them had diaries for the whole time, and others had school books. So we were able to make sure everything was factually accurate. And then we'd call in the others as we needed them for stories, like my dear friend Jo, who ended up in that hideous solitary confinement in first year.
Yes.
And so I contacted her and said, are you open to talking about this, and would you like me to write it? And she goes, yes. And so it also became very cathartic and healing for so many people involved in the process. In fact, Denise, who lives in Switzerland, said to me, I wish we'd written this book years ago. I would have saved myself hundreds of dollars in therapy.
And it would be more fun.
Yeah, exactly. So boarding school took its toll on everyone in different ways.
Yeah,
so
for sure.
Very cathartic, all of us coming back together. That's such a long answer, sorry.
You alluded to this going back to Prague book. So are you writing it yet?
I've started pulling it together. I've got different stories from different Czech people who escaped. And I'm really interested in exploring this issue of home. What happens if you're forced to leave your home? Then if you live somewhere else as an immigrant or a refugee, how do you make that your home? And then how do you reconcile living between two worlds? Which, if I think about it, is very much the question that we discussed earlier. That, what do you do when you belong in two different worlds, and how do you make that work? So I've started talking to a lot of Czechs who've got very interesting stories, especially those who escaped. And I've put together a whole lot of different chapter lines, and so I'm working on it and thinking on it. But I think Kimberly asked a question which relates to this, which is what attracted me to Prague in the first place, and which also fits in why I want to keep telling the stories of Prague. I saw the Berlin Wall fall, and if you get to read Alice to Prague, my first book, you'll see what a pivotal, life-changing experience that was for me. And that curiosity and independence I think I got from boarding school made me think, well, I want to see what's on the other side of that wall now that I can. And that's a very glib, short answer to 4 years of then prepping and planning and working back here as a lawyer until I found a way in. But I didn't go specifically for Prague, although I ended up in Prague, and Prague in its many facets became the love of my life. And in many ways, Prague to this day holds my heart.
It's so good. I'm looking forward to reading your new book, because even though I'm not from Czech Republic, I am from Holland. So for me, I'm living in a different country, and sometimes you don't feel like you belong, and with the language and everything. So be very, very interesting to read.
Oh,
Yes.
good. Thank
Yeah.
you. Thank you. That's very encouraging.
I don't know if my boss will let me interview you again.
Yeah.
But I'll read it anyway.
Please, Narelle.
Yes. Well, we have 5 more minutes. There's no more questions for other people. So maybe you can tell us what you're reading now.
Oh, okay. Some great reading, quite eclectic. I've just 2 books, one extreme to the other. What's the name of it? Then We Were Men. Is that When We Were Men?
I haven't read it.
It's not long been out, and it's the author is actually a wine writer, and it's about two. I'm sure you'll come across it, Ita. It's about 2 twins who lose their parents in a car accident, and they're swimmers, and it's unbelievably tragic and beautifully written. But I'm struggling because it's so sad, but it's exquisitely written. And then on the flip side, you know how I do love a good murder story.
Yes.
So I've just read The Nancys, which is tremendous. Have you heard of The Nancys?
No, Amanda probably has read it. So anyway, we only have a few more minutes. So if anyone wants to put the sound on or the video on, you're welcome to do that. And you can say whatever you like to Tanya, because we only have 4 more minutes. But yeah, I don't know that book you were talking about, but I can recommend Beyond Alice. Yeah. It's fabulous. But I would definitely, if you haven't read the other ones yet, read all of Tanya's books, because they all are different, but all, I find that you write with so much love. It's really lovely.
Thank you, Ita. Well, I find that I've had an incredibly fortunate life where I have got to do many, many, many different things. And sorry, Shirley, I think that's Shirley. Is that Shirley or Narelle?
Oh, that's Narelle.
Yes, We Were Not Men. That is it. Thank you very much.
Cool.
So I've had these incredible experiences, and I felt so drawn to tell the stories of the people I met growing up in the Outback, you know, during boarding school, and then the Czech. So I'm very excited about this next one. My opening chapter is about an escape and this Czech family escaping, and then I'm going to weave in these different stories of Prague and living here. So I'm very excited and grateful to be part of the Tamworth, you know, library network. And so I hope when that's done, we'll be able to talk about that in the future. But that might be a while yet, because COVID seems to have really slowed a lot of things down.
Yes,
so a bit behind the 8 ball with that one, but it's my goal, and hopefully this time next year I'll be nearly done.
Oh, and hopefully you'll be coming to Tamworth when it's Country Music Festival, and you can do a bit of guitar playing and singing.
My guitar playing's really bad these days.
Oh, that's good.
I could definitely get up and sing a few country songs. They always come back.
Yeah, we can do that in the library. Don't worry.
Fantastic. Oh, that'd be a hoot. I'd love it. I love it. Tamworth is my favourite library in Australia. Absolutely,
good.
I love it. Absolutely love it. That'd be so much fun.
We've at Country Music Festival, we do get musicians play and do story time for the kids, and we've had some book launches from musicians. So it was really good. Yeah, there were a few people that said thank you to you. So I think Kimberly and Chris. So yeah, thank you from all of us.
Thank you.
We have 1 more minute. So if anyone wants to jump in and say anything, you're welcome. Otherwise, I'll just say thank you so much, Tanya. It's always a pleasure to talk to you. Someone says, it definitely has been a wonderful hour. And thanks to me too. Oh, cool.
Absolutely, Ita, you're a natural interviewer, and you make it effortless and so much fun. So thank you in particular.
Oh, thank you. But you are so easy to talk to. So, and I love your book, so that makes it easy.
Well, hopefully everyone can get their hands on this. And inside, I've got all my
I love the photos.
Yes, and
I
the
have
photos.
to show the photo of your wriggling bottom.
Yeah, and
before we go. Oh, I can't find it. But I'll show you this one, because this is just gorgeous. Can you see it?
I know. My mum and dad.
Your mum is so gorgeous. Your dad is, strapping as well. But Your mum is something else.
I know. She still is. She still is. She's 82 and looks about 62.
Oh, lovely. All right. Thank you, everybody, for coming.
Thank you. Thanks to everyone. I've loved it. I hope lots of people get to read and enjoy, and write to me and tell me. I'm always loving receiving messages from people.
Oh, cool. I'm always commenting on your Facebook posts and stuff, but I'm doing a digital detox, so I won't be on social media this month. It's
excellent.
Scroll-free September.
That sounds very sensible. Enjoy
your
freedom.
I will. Thank you. All right. See you, everybody.
Bye.